Okay, so just to introduce the panel, to my left we have Claude Fussler, who's a special advisor on innovation and sustainability. To his left, so to your right, Rod Taylor, who's Forest Director of WWF. Then we have Katerina Tomov from DHL Deutsche Post, Jay Witherspoon from CH2M Hill, and Alex MacGilvray, who of course you already know. Perhaps if I could turn first to Claude, who was the rapporteur for the Buildings Working Group. Claude.
Thank you. We had a very interesting session, and actually there were two sessions on building yesterday. I listened to the first one, that was moderated by Jay, and then the afternoon session, where we were concentrating on living building solutions for quality of living. We first went to a sort of sobering comment made by Constant van Erschot, who is chairing work at the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, where they interviewed 1,400 professionals of the building industry a couple of years ago and asked them about energy efficiency in buildings. And the feedback general was that the professionals of the building industry underestimate grossly the impact of buildings on energy by almost a factor of 2. And by the same time, they overestimate the cost it would take to remediate and make buildings more efficient by anything of a factor of 2 to 5. So there's no wonder that with this mindset, this industry has very few initiatives and moves very slowly. Yet there is evidence that things can be done. And we had that evidence provided by first Alex Buchy of Holcim here in the country, evidence that affordable, clean, economically and ecologically efficient housing can be done. It's called, try to remember the name here, the Solusi Ruma, that some of the people in the country would know. We saw as well evidence of eco-housing that is very energy efficient, water efficient, the Bangkok airport, or larger, the Chongqing projects in China, the Tianjin eco-city. And they all come to one principle, which is integration of design. The more you integrate all the features of a house, and particularly make the envelope as efficient and as energy and resource conserving as possible by orientation, by the choice of material. And then after those passive structures, you add in the best environmentally friendly, water efficient, energy efficient appliances, and you add to this features that make the users aware of the features of a house and then can use it efficiently. You can achieve some remarkable results. More, and this was brought in particularly by the Carbon project, Caroline Baylis, expanded that and saying it's not only the integration of a building, but if you look at the integration of the whole site, and you look at mobility, water management, waste management, you can even go to larger improvements. It all comes back to a mindset. If designers and estate developers want to do it, it can be done. However, it doesn't happen by itself. I think you cannot, and this was again coming back to the World Business Council study, market forces will not create the change at the scale, at the momentum desired. You actually need intervention. Business doesn't like the word intervention, so I'll use the word stimulation. You need a set of stimulants that have to come from public policy. And one size doesn't fit all. We're about 7. The first is particularly relevant to emerging economies, deprived areas, where you don't even have property rights. So that's the first policy, is to get property rights, to get people with ownership and credit accountability so that they can get credit for financing building, and you need to get credit products that are adapted to deprived areas. The second stimulation that is general in any market is you need to tighten building codes. You need to tighten them towards efficiency objectives. This needs to be a process. It cannot be done overnight. If not, you have a lot of resistance, but you have to have a process which looks out at the targets and then gets people to move by ever tighter labeling schemes as well as permitting schemes. If you can do labeling schemes like in Europe now that have an impact on the transactions, which give a benefit for efficient housing when you rent or you acquire it, and a penalty when you rent or acquire it for inefficient housing, you can get movement in the market. Another mechanism to get movement in the market, quite unanimously by all the participants in the workshop, is reinvestment pricing for energy and water. If you do subsidize below market costs or below real costs, and particularly below real reinvestment cost, the price of energy, you are not going to foster efficiency. You are going to foster wastage. Beyond price signals, you can as well get into permitting processes that advantage through speed and faster access to market the products and the projects that are most efficient. You need more consumer-friendly technologies because it, again, you know, the most efficient house will not deliver its promise if people keep the lights on all day and cool the rooms too much, as most of us have been suffering from here. You have to create awareness through sort of dashboards that are consumer-friendly and give some alarms when you exceed certain levels or when you forget to switch off certain appliances. You need to develop an energy, through education, an energy-aware culture that gets people to stop trying always to find the business case for heat pumps when we don't do this for marble floors today. You know, why don't we do ROIs on marble floors, but we need to wonder forever if we'll install double glazed windows, insulation, or heat pumps. And finally, another point is you have to educate the total supply chain, the various craftsmen and workers in the supply chain to be aware of the latest technologies, and particularly the most difficult nut to crack is retrofitting of buildings, you know, which is quite often, like in this city, 98% of the building stock is already in place. There's only about 2% new build every year. So you need to get those new competencies of craftsmen who can deliver integrated technologies that retrofit buildings with appliances, with insulation, etc. One thing to be aware of, to conclude, is the sort of one feature incentives. Example of, you know, France has incentivized purchase of double glazed windows, and the result of such programs is that people who already had double glazed windows but wanted a better window frame were taking advantage of it. Or wood heating was another example, where people who already had a fireplace, you know, went to a better fireplace instead of actually getting the market to get more of those features. So there is a lot of modeling in place. This World Business Council study is actually a very powerful model that can test any policy package towards its outcome. And I can only recommend to look at it on wbcsd.org and try to download it to look at those that work.
And I hope you won't all be crashing the website in the next 30 seconds, although maybe it would be good if you crashed the website. Thank you very much indeed, Claude. I particularly like the emphasis on, or rather the idea that there is an underestimation of the effects of the housing stock, but also an overestimation of the remediation costs, because of course what that means is there's a massive opportunity. Can we, now, Rod.
Yes. Good evening, good morning. Our group talked about technologies and new business models for maintaining forests and their biodiversity values. So we talked briefly on the kind of smart technologies that can play a role here. These include the new remote sensing technologies such as Google Earth and GeoWikis that can help monitor the state of the forests. These include new technologies for traceability of commodities and wood, so we can tell whether they're coming from well-managed forests or forests under threat. Work with isotope technology, chips, and other devices that help with tracking. And thirdly, we talked about smart sensors that can help with better irrigation and fertilizer by monitoring soil conditions in plantations and agricultural crops and so on. So we talked for a little while about technologies, but mostly we talked about business models. And we recognized that there were very good business models for looking after forests, everything from payment for environmental services to forest certification to various practices that reduce the impacts of logging or agriculture. But while all these business models were there, in theory at least, or in practice, across the board they are undermined by lack of land tenure, uncertainty over spatial planning, regulations that are in conflict, so we don't have the basic enabling policies for these models to work. And as a result of that, in many parts of Indonesia, for example, we end up with a kind of frontier mentality where everybody's trying to get what they can while they can. There's a massive discount factor on any kind of future value, so there's no kind of incentive for taking care of forests or their biodiversity or thinking long term. So these problems are all well recognized and they're almost intractable. How do you fix massive problems of forest governance when so many different layers of government are involved, so many different vested interests? And one novel idea came up was the kind of idea of a green economy pilot zone, or a district that could be given a creative license to resolve some of these issues. The model that was put forward was kind of an industrial park in China, where they create a geographic space where all the old bureaucracies and rules don't apply, and there's opportunity to have creativity in policy setting. So we don't know how feasible this idea, but perhaps in Indonesia, some districts could be declared as green economy districts, and all these creative ideas such as land swaps. So for example, if you're a palm oil concession holder and your concession is in a forest area, can that be swapped for an area of degraded land? Mechanisms to bring communities and smallholders in participating in these economies so that they prosper and their rights are respected. Sorting out the many overlapping concessions that undermine security and tenure, having smart systems for resolving land disputes. So if there were places where we could have some policy creativity and get away from all the constraints on that, that might be an interesting way forward rather than trying to do is that better? Across the board reforms at national level. So I think it was a very rich discussion, and I'm trying to summarize it very quickly, but I'll try and stop there, otherwise I have to go into a whole level of detail more.
Thank you very much, Rod, indeed. I think it's interesting to note that when we think of innovation and experimentation, we tend to think of that in business terms, in terms of products, in terms of processes, but of course it's also valid in terms of policies, and we don't have time to rely purely on incrementalism and try everything that doesn't work before we find something that does work. We need to try lots of different things. I'm now actually going to turn to Alex to talk about the energy piece. Alex, now that you've had time to recover from your previous panel.
Yes, thank you. Well, we had a fantastic group, and in fact, all of the work was done by the panelists and then by the discussion leaders. We had 3 discussion leaders, and in fact, our working group broke into 3 sub-working groups to kind of tackle particular issues. So I'm not going to run through all of the points because there was sort of 9 fairly concrete things that were tabled by those 3 groups. But if I tried to summarize them, kind of cluster them into some sort of broader themes, we were looking at smart energy systems, but we soon got into discussions about traffic congestion. In the Indonesian case, we looked at other examples that fell outside sectors, and the context was I think was given to us by a very thoughtful presentation from GBS at Logica, talking about the transition from a kind of product to a service, and the analogy that he gave in the development of a smart system was the mobile phone transition from fixed rate calls 20 years ago to much smarter ways of billing people, and indeed even sort of free ways of making phone calls today. So, you know, a major transition and quite a disruptive one. So we were interested in disruption. We were interested in cross-sector solutions. And we weren't all technical experts in smart grids, so we didn't kind of come up with a blueprint for how to kind of roll out smart grids across Indonesia. The three things that I think came out of the subgroups, the need for leadership and collaboration, but in any collaboration that somebody has to take the first step. And so what we were looking for was ways to get that first step taken, followed shortly by other people in a collaboration, but not waiting until everybody was ready to move together. And that is kind of easier to say than to achieve, but there's a sort of fine balance between leadership and collaboration, almost a dance, and that was seen to be very important, not technical. This is about personal leadership and group collaboration rather than kind of gadgets. There was quite a bit of discussion, in fact, about whether all the technology we needed was already in place, and you know, I wouldn't say the group agreed on that, but there were certainly a lot of people in the group who felt that this wasn't really a technical challenge at all, implementing smart systems. It was about transaction costs and individual and social costs and benefits. Another thing was about clarity and transparency, and so we as a working group wanted the objectives of a smart system intervention to be very clear, so that people could really understand the costs and benefits of it. And they wanted a really clear policy framework within which smart systems would be implemented. And we felt that without that sort of clarity and without transparency, for example, on issues of subsidies, which have come up a number of times in other sessions as well, that it would be difficult to get people to take that first step that was identified. And again, easier said than done, but I think in the case of Indonesia at least, we're beginning to see some of that policy clarity emerging from the kind of high-level leadership. We also want to see grassroots leadership as well, from the leadership from the top and from the bottom. I think the third common theme that emerged from these groups was about education and empowerment. And there was a view that, good as we are, we consumers aren't quite sophisticated enough to understand some of the technological promise that is being developed by organizations that are thinking very laterally, and that somehow there needs to be more work done on building demand for smart solutions, and building ways that we as consumers and citizens can actually employ those, that they solve the problems we have, and that we're not sort of left not quite understanding what is the promise that's being offered by companies. So somewhere in there, a kind of stronger education, starting in some cases from quite young, but in other cases kind of going through life. I think, actually I said three. The fourth thing I think that was very strong was a need for people to be very clear about interoperability. Now, I don't quite know what that means, but I think what it means is that you now, or very soon, will be able to recharge your mobile phone using a single plug, socket, piece of equipment, whatever your mobile phone is. And I think that's got to be a good thing. That's certainly a challenge for me as a mobile phone user, is I never have the right charger available. And if that sort of interoperability can be agreed at the beginning of a technology rather than 20 years after that technology is invented, that has to be a good thing for speeding progress and uptake. So 4 things in that case.
Interoperability sounds like a fantastic idea, but one has to ask, I mean, there are actually a very limited number of mobile phone manufacturers. Why is it that now, actually, it's not possible to find chargers that work for different ones? It's quite extraordinary in many respects. Could I now turn, please, to Katerina Tomov, who will talk about her group.
I was in the transport and mobility group, and we had really a very good mixture of people in the group, so very lively discussions. We had experts for sea transportation, road transportation, air transportation, logistics providers who can do all of it. We had car manufacturers, NGOs, technological providers, so we already had almost everyone needed for a discussion like this in the group. So the outcome was respectively rich. I'll try to narrow it down to road transportation ideas because I think the area where we had most ideas and where the ideas also covered on the one hand the logistics part, but then on the other hand also the very tangible transportation and mobility part for every citizen. So the 5 things we came up with were, if you look at transportation and mobility, you have, first of all, you have the vehicles, so the things that move around. The main idea was push the technological progress that's there, so push for alternative vehicles, maybe also for more innovative vehicles that have smart systems where they're in contact with taxi companies who know where you have the traffic jams, or maybe not only rebuild vehicles that you have, but build completely new vehicles with alternative motors. So that was the first one. Second, look at the network where this vehicle drives around. For logistics, I think one of the key drivers here could be consolidation of the supply chain, so have either one provider doing the whole supply chain or have competition work more closely together to increase load factors and decrease all those half-empty or empty trucks running around. But also improve the network for the everyday user. So especially for developing countries, increase mobility through public transport systems. And then once they're there, try to think about smart ways how you can incentivize people to use it. One we came up with was to introduce multimodal smart cards. So you have a card that you can use for all kinds of public transportation, and that can, for example, even give you discounts for shopping, or you can collect bonus miles or something like that and be incentivized that way. Another thing we were looking at, if you have the vehicle and the network, you also have the person who drives the vehicle. And we've seen that in especially logistics industry, it works very well to train the drivers. I think we've also heard this several times during the last days, how many millions of liters you can save if you really train the driver. So we thought that maybe this could be transferred to the private drivers, and one way could be to have a fancy online training course that might be enough incentive to log on and have an interactive training. Another maybe more pushy approach would be to include it as a mandatory part of getting your driver's license. So having a part of the test, as a part of the test that you have to prove that you can drive efficiently. Then the 4th one was looking at reducing the purpose of travel at all. So I think there are already good ideas out there like video conferencing that can replace meetings. They're not fully used yet, so I think part of it is because of technological availability, but on the other hand, it's maybe also that they're not fancy enough. So like a video game, I mean, usually people like to do games on screen, so if it could be somewhat more fancy and maybe more people would promote it, that could be an alternative. And last but not least, rather as an overarching system, provide more transparency, and I heard this from several of the other speakers, to make it easier also for private people, but also for business people, shippers or companies, to choose what is actually would be a green means of transportation, rather than having everyone to find out proactively. Introduce a standard. So on the one hand, you'd have standard measurement of carbon. For example, if we take trucks, we don't know if you'd probably if I ask, be you an expert or not, you to calculate the carbon footprint of your car or a truck, we'd probably have as many results as we have people in this room. So have one neutral platform where everyone provides the data, and then have a common standard and even a benchmarking system. For example, a traffic light or something like that. It works well, for example, with fridges. I'm not sure whether you have it in Indonesia, but in many parts of the world you have the fridge and it has a traffic light that shows you exactly how energy efficient a fridge is. So the people can actively choose, be it the private people or people in business, without having to go through all the carbon accounting and finding the right standards. So I think this was trying to summarize the outcome of our group, and the people who are here from the group are welcome to amend afterwards.
Thank you very much indeed, Katerina. And now, last but not least, I'd like to turn to Jay Witherspoon from CH2M Hill, who's going to talk about the water working group.
Yeah, thank you. And like the other groups, we had a very lively discussion, and we're going to start out pretty bold. And we had six.
We like that.
We had 6 takeaway messages. The first one is water is life. Without water, there would be no life. And what that really means is that we need to be looking at the total water cycle, from the first drop of water that's either harvested from the rain, stored, treated, used, reused, and recycled. We need to be aware of that. So we wanted to make sure that the group understood that we have to be accountable for our water footprint, and then think beyond technology and look at both a technology, a social, and a political solution in trying to address the water issue as we go forth. Our second point was to build and use relevant communities collaboratively focused on smart water usage, smart farming, human health, and in the environment. And that means starting at the lowest denominator, starting in the communities, coming and pulling together the stakeholders, which are the residents, the businesses, the farmers, the suppliers of water, the treaters of water, the forest, all those stakeholders at a community level, then go to a regional level, then go to a state level, and then go to a country level, and then go to a global level, trying to enforce human health and safety as you go forth. The third area we looked at was harnessing the power of technology. Technology has a lot of balls in the air that could come and help you. But with technology, we came up with 2 strategies. One is the passive ability to conserve water and reduce water usage, which gets you about 50 or 60% of the way on your conservation curve. The other 40% requires some type of treatment. So you have to balance the energy needed for the treatment to get the water that you want to recycle and reuse. And as you go further to get closer to 100% recycle, the higher the energy, the higher the cost, and the higher impacts on other medias are seen as you go forth with that. We also saw technology as a way to reduce risk and do it as risk mediation so that you could have a sustainable water supply or a crop for the next 150 years. We had some examples of a sugar farmer in Australia who's been in business for 150 years and starting to look at the extreme water flooding events that happened in Queensland, and is that going to be a reoccurring theme under climate change? And if it is, how is he going to stay in business for another 150 years? Does he have to move his crops up the equator, down the equator, or change his method of farming? So it's looking at risk mediation as a solution. The fourth area, as business leaders, we want to be very bold and fix the water market. So it was actually fixing the water market, so you could take it either way that you like. What that really means is in two areas. The first is come up with a strategy or mechanism that market prices the water. We saw big disparities in two examples of the price of water. In one case, it was in California, where the farmers have had a grant that's over 100 years old on their water rights, and so they're paying a very low price for that water. And today's value of that water, it's 2,000 to 3,000 times higher than the value of that water, yet that rights is almost unbreakable, and they had water fights and all that type of thing. The other example was the cultural differences you see, say, in the Middle East or in some of the Asia-Pacific countries, where water is a given right. It's free. And then you suddenly start to charge for the water to be treated, to meet the water quality standard, to get the impaired water treated so that you could have it for growth. They don't want to pay. So you have to figure out how you balance these old antiquated laws and rights and also the cultural effects on a political and technical ability to go forth. And the second area is on fixing the water market is on the governance side. How is water really governed? Who is the responsible group to do that? In many countries in the world, the politicians can lose their job by imposing regulations and laws that cause the water rates to go up, or lack of water, or saying no to industry and to growth, so because they have very conflicting needs and wants. Fourth area that we looked at is lack of a very powerful leadership and governance in managing water globally. As humans, we react very quickly to the events that occurred just recently, the earthquake in Japan, the earthquake in New Zealand. We react within sometimes minutes. Water scarcity and lack of water in communities is a slow growing event that at some point it's going to hit the top, and we'll say, why didn't we think about fixing this 25 years ago? So in our human nature, we react very quickly to things that we could see, destruction, floods, all those type of things, but we don't see the lack of forest, we don't see the rivers dropping, we don't see basins losing their groundwater, and we don't really receive that as humans as a problem. We always think someone else could fix that. So we need to kind of come up with a strategy and thought along those lines. And then finally, our last point was, who pays for it? Okay? We talked a lot about that, and that includes some of these strategies and mechanisms, but for example, if you're an oil-rich country, you could buy your water. And those oil-rich countries will buy that water until that resource disappears. And what it will do is artificially create a sense of security in that community, and that community will grow based on how much water that they have. But when that resource disappears, their storage and everything disappears as well. So we need to take a look at that. And also we're seeing other countries struggle along the lines that I mentioned earlier about wanting to have safe drinking water, safe produce, and figuring out how to treat more of their impaired waters as they go forth, and then balancing the energy demand or resource needs together.
Thank you very much indeed, Jay. In just a second, I'm going to turn to the audience, and if you have burning questions, then this will be your chance to ask them. But first, I want to sort of raise a general issue, and I wonder who's going to want to take this. We've spoken a lot, in fact, about smart technologies. In some respects, it seems to me that the problem that we may have, or one of the problems that we may have, is that we may have smart technologies, but quite often we have dumb users, and we have dumb consumers. We're quite good at inventing new things. We're not really very good, or very good even at understanding transformative change in societies. And I think that's illustrated very well, in fact, by what Jay was just saying about crisis versus chronic risks. We respond quite well as human beings to crises in our societies. We respond incredibly badly to chronic risks, despite the fact that, of course, in the long term, they may be far more damaging. So I wondered if there were any of you on the panel who had thoughts that you'd like to add to that, or ideas you'd like to throw out.
Yeah, I think I don't think we have dumb users, because look at how fast we take up iPads, iPhones, Android, and God knows what. I think it's a bit the syndrome of the frog boiling slowly. We don't have a sense of crisis of the environment degradation because it does go very slowly up to a point where you have a crisis. So the question is always, how do you create the so-called burning platform? I think that has been business jargon. You know, when you wanted to get things done, you created the burning platform. So you created a virtual environment where you actually had to do something. And I sense that particularly in meetings like this, where leaders talk to leaders, you know, people who have created their own burning platform, we always get into this wall in sort of how we get mass movement, how do we get momentum and scale. And we can take the politicians out of the equation. Quite often we are, you know, business should do this, business should do that. I think it is something we need to link up with stimulation and intervention that creates a new way of playing. I think we have the technical solutions there. Actually, they're not completely competitive from an economic standpoint because the market, as we have been reminded yesterday by the TEEB project, the market is full of externalities. And at some point of time, despite of all the leadership, you cannot lean enough out of the window and become uncompetitive by adopting some new technologies. So you have to create something.
I know that Jay and Katerina and Rod also want to come in on this. I might ask first to Katerina, but as it happens, I know that she trained as a psychologist, so she may have particular insights here.
That was exactly the way I wanted to approach it, with a very short answer. I think on the one hand it's very difficult, but at the same time easy to change behavior of human beings. You either have to make their old behavior pattern very painful and then they'll change, or you have the new behavior to make the new behavior pattern very joyful. So I think these are the two ways, and I think making things painful are, for example, applying taxes, costs to it, or make it very inconvenient. And a joyful way we've just heard with the iPhones, that apparently everyone loves to play with these things. So I think if we keep those two things in mind, we can change human behavior and have the smart user rather than the dumb user.
And just to carry on a little bit, I think the foundation of that change has to be accountability, and to really figure out what, as business leaders, what is our true water footprint. That means how much water does it take for each of the components of our product in order for us to be competitive in the market. And then how do we go back and minimize that footprint to be the smallest we can to still be competitive in the market area. And I think that we lack a lot of that because we look at water just as what flows out of the tap. We don't look at how much water was used to dye that material, how much water was used to create that piece of plastic, how much water was used to ship that from point A to point B. So I think if you start as business leaders to look at the awareness of how much actual water you actually do use, then you start to see ways to save that. And once you start to do that, you start to see the public responding as well. So we need to set the pattern and move forward and have awareness of what the issue really is.
I want to turn quickly to Rod, and if there are people who want to come in on this or other points, then please raise your hand so I can identify you while Rod is talking.
Yeah, I think you have to take these really complex issues and present them in a way that can appeal and get emotion from the public. So, for example, last year we ran a very successful campaign on tigers, and we're able to have really simple, emotional messages about the fact that there's very few tigers left on the planet. And behind that were all the issues of water and forest and everything else, but the tiger is something that the public can relate to. And similarly, as NGOs and companies, you know, we put producers through enormous hoops to produce certified palm oil or certified forests. We have a kind of obligation then to convince the public that they can feel good buying those certified products and explain why they should feel good buying them, rather than just leaving the producers having to do all the hard work and not having a market as a result of that.
Thank you very much. Are there people in the audience who want to come in on any of this? Please raise your hand if you... No? We obviously have a very shy audience. But Alex wants to come in.
Yeah, I am thinking about water climate. I mean, last 12 or 18 months, we've actually had a whole series of acute natural disasters, many of them climate-related, in all sorts of different parts of the world: Mexico, Middle East, Australia, Southeast Asia, and now tornadoes in the USA, which is controversial, but kind of in my view, kind of probably climate-related or a sort of stark warning. So in a sense, we don't have to worry about, I don't think, about this sort of issue about not responding to chronic signals, because there are actually a lot of acute signals now. I think what we have to worry about is whether humans actually are good at responding to acute signals. And I very much wonder what will be the response in the USA to this latest round of tornadoes. And what I fear is that there's a sort of human nature that causes some slightly perverse backlash against acute signals as well as a blindness to chronic signals, and that the climate skepticism that's been growing in the USA will actually accelerate as a result of tornadoes in a sort of war against climate mentality as a result of the suffering that's been happening. And I don't know enough about how the public has responded in Australia to the droughts and then floods, but it seems to be that there is a backlash against the carbon tax in Australia that it doesn't compute to me that people who just a few months ago were suffering from extreme economic hardship as a result of climate problems should now be protesting against a carbon tax, unless there's something quite weird going on that is a challenge that I would like to throw back to psychologists to tell us what's going on and how we get over this sort of perverse reaction to short-term pain as well as kind of invisibility of long-term trends.
Let me raise one other issue, which I'd like to hear your views on. We've spoken a bit in the last session also about value chains and the importance of looking outside the boundaries of your own company, looking for partnerships with the government, NGOs, and also with suppliers, and of course also with your consumers. One element of that which is potentially being unlocked is the prospect of co-innovation. So innovating products with your consumers and using that as a way of getting consumer buy-in, at the stage of design, which is another thing that we've spoken about a bit, going back to first principles, design. So I wondered if any of you wanted to talk about how those issues play in the sectors that you've been looking at and how you view those issues. Jay?
We spent a lot of time really talking about the lowest denominator, which is really the local community that is next door to the water resource or the forest, and how to get the relevant stakeholders together to agree upon a path forward that's good for the checks and balances that are needed in order for that community to survive and be sustainable and not to dry up or disappear. And so starting at that lowest denominator is really where you need to start to focus some of those thoughts. Those then feed into the regions, and the region has to look at, and if you're a mayor of a region or a governor of a region, how is that region's interacting points? Because they're going to have maybe 20 or 30 cities that will have all these strategies on how they're going to be sustainable. How do you roll that into a regional plan? And then how do you roll the regional plan into a state plan? And then how do you roll that into a country plan? With the idea of showing the benefits that being green and sustainable doesn't cost. It's actually the only way that we're going to be able to survive. So you have to get that across, and once you get that across, then you're starting to look at making decisions that outweigh one factor or another. Can you grow that same produce in this region now that you have historically, because it's such a water user? Can we switch to something else that has less or get rid of it? Those are the kind of decisions you have to deal in a region, and sometimes it's cultural based, political, and technically based.
Katrina?
I would have make you exercise a bit. I would have an answer, but less as a representative of the group, but rather as a representative of DHL, because we have actually done several green products together with, or invented several green products together with our customers. One is, for example, a carbon dashboard which we've developed with a customer, and it's kind of a software where they can slice and look at carbon data the way they need it and control their carbon data. Another one is carbon neutral shipping service, where we found out that customers would actually be willing to offset the carbon produced by a shipment. However, they have not the knowledge to know what would be reliable and good credits, not to have it as greenwashing. So if you provide, we found out if you provide the whole service, you have an external certification company that certifies the methodology. We calculate this with, we have all the systems, and we make sure we have the right projects with the right standards, they would actually buy it. And we brought this to the market in 2006, and I think by now many logistics companies have copied it, and it's within DHL the fastest growing product that we have. So these are only two examples where we've seen that what you said actually works very well, including the customer in developing new service ideas around green.
Alex.
I think one of the best examples I've seen recently is the development of concentrated detergents, washing liquids, where you if you go on YouTube, you'll find 5 or 6 different organizations claiming that they initiated the development of clean detergents, including Walmart, Procter & Gamble, Unilever, a kind of a green startup company in the space, and others. And clearly, in fact, the originator of that was women who found the ever growing size of liquid detergent bottles weighing 5 kilos and more far too heavy, and the feedback from the user was what sparked all of those groups to start figuring out ways to make concentrated powder that was effective and would convince the mainly women who do most of the world's washing that actually the lighter product was also a better product. And it's been quite a dramatic change, but it can only really have come from the consumer, because otherwise people wouldn't have been confident buying it. I think it's a nice example of co-creation.
These are nice examples which show that it actually works in a business setting. In other words, sustainability works, but it's also sustainable business. It works commercially. And I think that's very, very key. If there's not a question in the audience, then I presume that must be... Oh, sorry, there is. Where? Yes, please. Very, very quickly.
Thank you. My name is Chris from Bina Bangsa School, and I would like to ask a question to the transport working group. What do you think is a viable solution for traffic problems in Jakarta, and how do you implement it while at the same time reduce carbon emission produced by cars? Please take into account that Jakarta is quite a big city with a big population, most of which are quote-unquote dumb users, and we fall into the low to mid-income class.
That's a simple problem for you, Katerina, to solve in the next 30 seconds.
We'll all appreciate that.
Yeah, I don't know Jakarta very well, but it didn't take me long to understand that this is a problem, because my assistant had calculated the time that I would need from the airport to this hotel with 15 minutes. And when I arrived, I think he looked it up on Google Maps, and when I arrived here, I had taken 2 hours and 15 minutes, so...
You have a very optimistic assistant.
I sent him a message to say that maybe we need to do this differently next time. So we actually talked about that problem, and of course the answer is not very simple, otherwise I think someone else would have solved this problem before. We had different ideas on the problem, so let me just pose them to you, and you can choose the ones that you find most suitable. I've named already a few. I mean, one could be to limit the number of vehicles within the city. For example, if you have logistics providers, have only one do all the distribution and pack it all and have full vehicles rather than everyone running around with one. Of course, that would mean some sort of monopoly for one provider, which I'm not sure whether that's possible.
Katerina, by the way, works for DHL.
Yeah, sorry. Of course, we would be happy to volunteer for that task. And if you look at public transportation, maybe other big cities, I mean, although it's difficult to find one that's comparable, could be a good inspiration for that, also to limit or put a high tax on certain ways of transportation. And the third one would probably be to find a smart public transportation system. I understand the buses are doing already quite well, but what I heard is that several people, at least in our group, would also be willing to cycle, but they fear, for once, that they will be run over, and second, that probably they'll do something good for exercising, but at the same time, with all the smog and the and the emissions they breathe in, they fear it might actually be more dangerous to bike. So maybe finding a way to have, and I'm not talking about motorbikes, but bicycles, to have that. I think that would be, not sure whether that solves everything.
Thank you very much indeed, Katharina. We're already over time, so unless anyone has a burning idea that they wish to put out there, I'd like it if you could join me in thanking our excellent panel, who've done a very, very good job.